Caleb and Silas were not treasure hunters. They were industrial surgeons of the maritime world, men who made their living dissecting the carcasses of dead ships. Their salvage yard, a sprawling expanse of gravel and twisted metal on the rainy coast of Oregon, was where vessels went to die. Their latest patient was the SS Ironclad, a hulking, 70-foot naval tugboat commissioned in 1943. It had spent the last 4 decades rotting in a brackish backwater channel, serving as a nesting ground for seagulls and a canvas for rust. To the average observer, the Ironclad was a liability, a floating tetanus shot that would cost more to tow than it was worth in scrap iron. But Caleb and Silas saw the world in terms of weight and alloy. They saw the heavy-gauge pre-atomic steel hull, the solid bronze propellers, and the massive copper windings inside the derelict generators. They bought the boat at a blind auction for a price that made their competitors laugh, convinced they could extract enough high-grade metal to double their investment before the hull finally collapsed. The towing process was a nightmare of snapped cables and high tides, but once the Ironclad was dry-docked in their dismantling bay, the real work began. The ship was a fortress of obsolete engineering. The brothers started, as they always did, in the heart of the beast, the engine room. It was a cavernous, suffocating space located below the waterline, dominated by a single house-sized diesel engine that had been silent since the Nixon administration. The air down there was thick, tasting of ancient diesel, mold, and wet iron. The silence was absolute, broken only by the echo of their steel-toed boots on the diamond plate grating. Their plan was methodical: strip the peripheral pumps and valves, remove the copper wiring, and finally, cut the massive engine block into manageable chunks for the smelter. For 3 days, the work was grueling but predictable. They moved through the gloom with the efficiency of men who had done this 1,000 times, their cutting torches slicing through pipes and brackets. However, on the 4th morning, while working on the starboard side of the fuel storage assembly, Caleb noticed something that didn't align with his mental map of the ship. He was removing a series of intake valves near the main fuel bunker when he realized the spacing was wrong. According to the standard Liberty-class tugboat design, and the faded blueprints they had taped to the mess hall wall, the fuel bunker should have extended flush against the outer hull ribbing. But when Caleb tapped the bulkhead with his wrench, the sound wasn't the deep, hollow boom of an empty tank, nor the dull thud of a full one. It was a sharp, metallic ring, followed by a vibration that stopped abruptly. It sounded like a plate welded over another plate. Silas joined him, bringing a high-intensity work light to inspect the seam. The welding on this specific section of the bulkhead was different. The rest of the engine room featured the rough, hurried bead welding typical of wartime production, where speed was prioritized over aesthetics. But this particular seam, running vertically behind a stack of hydraulic pipes, was meticulous. It was a precision weld, ground down and painted over to blend perfectly with the surrounding steel. It was camouflage. They measured the distance from the engine block to the visible bulkhead, then went topside to measure the distance from the deck railing to the outer hull. The math revealed a discrepancy of exactly 36 inches. There was a 3-foot wide void running the entire height of the engine room that appeared on no blueprints and served no mechanical purpose. It was a ghost space, sealed off from the world. Hey everyone! We have to take a quick pause here because the discovery we are about to make in this engine room is going to blow your mind, and we need your support to keep these salvage adventures going. We are incredibly close to hitting our goal of 10,000 subscribers, and we need you to smash that subscribe button right now to help us cross the finish line. Also, if you're enjoying the mystery, consider using the Super Thanks button below. It directly funds our next big project. And we are dying to know, where in the world are you watching this video from? Drop your country in the comments. We want to see how far the Ironclad story is traveling. Now, let's light the torches and see what's inside this wall. The brothers knew that in shipbreaking, unexplained voids usually meant one of 2 things: smuggled contraband from a previous crew, or a hasty repair to cover up structural damage. But the precision of the concealment suggested something far more intentional than a drug stash or a patch job. This was architectural. They decided to breach the void. Caleb fired up the oxyacetylene torch, adjusting the mix until the flame was a hissing blue needle of heat. He chose a spot waist-high, away from any potential electrical conduits, and touched the flame to the mysterious steel plate. The paint bubbled and blackened instantly, the smell of burning chemical coating filling the cramped space. As the metal turned cherry red and then molten white, Caleb began to cut a square inspection window. The steel was thicker than they anticipated, naval-grade armor plating, not the standard mild steel used for interior bulkheads. It took 20 minutes of intense focus and sweat to complete the 4 cuts. When the square of metal finally fell inward, it didn't clang against a floor. It landed with a heavy, muffled thud, as if hitting wood or canvas. Silas stepped forward with the inspection camera, a long fiber-optic snake light usually used to check piston cylinders. He fed the camera through the glowing red aperture. On the small monitor, the grain of the image was dark and fuzzy, but slowly, shapes began to resolve. The void was not empty. It was packed floor-to-ceiling with crate-like structures, draped in what looked like heavy, oil-treated tarpaulins. The brothers looked at each other, the same thought crossing their minds. This wasn't part of the ship. They widened the hole, cutting away enough steel to physically squeeze through. The air that rushed out of the compartment was stale and dry, carrying a distinct scent that wasn't diesel or rot. It smelled like old paper and beeswax. Caleb squeezed his upper body through the jagged opening, shining his flashlight into the gloom. The compartment was a perfect rectangle, welded watertight. Stacked against the far wall were 4 large wooden crates, bound in iron straps that had rusted to a deep orange but held firm. Stenciled on the side of the nearest crate, barely visible through the dust of decades, was not a U.S. Navy serial number, but a symbol that made Caleb's blood run cold. It was a black eagle holding a wreath, a symbol of the enemy the Ironclad had been built to destroy. The sight of the distinct angular black eagle stenciled on the rotting wood froze Caleb and Silas in place. In the damp, shadowy confines of the SS Ironclad's engine room, the symbol felt like a hallucination. They were standing deep inside the hull of a vessel built in a shipyard in Philadelphia, sailed by American sailors and decommissioned by the U.S. Navy. The presence of official German state markings from the 1940s, specifically the Reichsadler used by the Nazi regime, was a historical impossibility that their minds struggled to process. For a long minute, the only sound was the hissing of the cooling cutting torch and the rhythmic dripping of condensation from the overhead pipes. This wasn't just a hidden compartment, it was a contradiction welded into the ship's frame. Silas reached out, his gloved finger hovering over the faded black ink, as if to wipe it away and prove it was just grease or grime, but the stencil remained, staring back at them from the darkness of the void. They retreated from the hole to reassess. The brothers were used to finding oddities in scrap ships, crew diaries, forgotten tools, even the occasional bottle of illicit whiskey tucked behind a ventilation duct, but this was in a completely different stratosphere. They realized that whatever was in those crates was heavy, dense, and deliberately entombed. The hole they had cut was too small to extract the boxes, and the jagged edges of the molten steel were a hazard. They needed to widen the breach. Working with a renewed, almost frantic energy, Caleb fired the torch back up. He began cutting a much larger section of the false bulkhead, tracing a line that would remove a 4x4-foot panel, effectively exposing the entire hidden vault. The heat in the engine room rose, the air filling with the acrid smoke of burning paint and vaporized metal, but neither brother stopped to wipe the sweat from their eyes. They were driven by a primal curiosity mixed with a creeping sense of dread. When the large steel slab finally broke free, they used a chain hoist rigged to the overhead I-beam to carefully lower it to the deck. The full interior of the secret compartment was now visible under the glare of their halogen worklights. There were 4 crates in total, stacked 2 by 2. They were constructed of thick, reinforced oak, bound with iron bands that showed surprisingly little rust, likely due to the airtight seal of the compartment. The lack of oxygen and moisture had preserved them in a time capsule state. Caleb attached the hoist's hook to the iron banding of the top left crate. As he cranked the chain, the winch groaned under the strain. The crate was shockingly heavy for its size, far denser than a box of engine parts or ammunition. It swung free from the stack, swaying ominously as they guided it out of the void and onto the greasy diamond plate floor of the engine room. The crate sat there, an alien object in the American engine room. Silas fetched a heavy crowbar and a mallet. He wedged the tip of the bar under the lid of the crate, expecting the wood to splinter easily after 80 years of dormancy. Instead, the oak was stubborn, requiring Silas to hammer the bar deep into the seam. With a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot in the confined space, the first plank gave way. They worked around the perimeter, popping the iron nails one by one until the lid could be leveraged off. Underneath the wood lay a layer of oil-impregnated paper, brittle and brown, folded neatly over the contents. Caleb peeled back the paper with the reverence of an archaeologist unwrapping a mummy. Beneath the paper was a packing material made of wood wool, fine shavings of timber used to cushion delicate cargo. Silas reached in and pushed the wood wool aside. His hand struck something cold, smooth, and metallic. He grasped the object and pulled it out. It wasn't a machine part. It was a bar. A heavy, rectangular ingot of dull, yellow metal. Caleb brought the work light closer, the beam reflecting off the object with a mesmerizing, buttery luster that no other metal possesses. It was gold. But it wasn't a standard jagged nugget or a rough pour. It was a professionally cast bullion bar. Stamped deeply into the surface was the circular emblem of the Reichsbank, the central bank of the German Reich, along with a purity mark of .999 and a serial number. The brothers stared at the object, the weight of it pulling Silas's hand down. This single bar, roughly a kilogram, was worth tens of thousands of dollars. And the crate was full of them. They frantically cleared the rest of the wood wool. The crate contained 3 rows of bars, stacked 2 deep. A quick mental tally put the count at over 50 bars in just this single box. The sheer value sitting on the dirty floor of the tugboat was enough to buy their salvage yard 10 times over. But the joy of the discovery was instantly tempered by the terrifying context. This was Nazi gold. It was plunder. The existence of this gold on a U.S. tugboat implied a narrative that didn't fit the history books. Had the crew stolen it? Had it been seized and then misplaced by corrupt officers? The implications were legal dynamite. If they reported it, the government would seize it immediately as war booty or evidence. If they didn't, they were technically trafficking in stolen wartime assets. They moved to the second crate, needing to know if the contents were identical. The extraction process was faster this time, their adrenaline masking the physical exertion. They pried the lid off the second box. It was packaged identically, oil paper and wood wool, but the contents were different. Instead of the uniform yellow of gold, the light caught the chaotic sparkle of gemstones. The crate was filled with small, velvet drawstring pouches. Caleb opened one, pouring the contents into his gloved palm. Diamonds! Dozens of cut, industrial, and jewelry-grade diamonds tumbled out, accompanied by loose settings where stones had been hastily pried from rings and necklaces. This was darker than the gold. The gold was bank reserves. The diamonds were likely looted from individuals, victims of the regime. The energy in the room shifted from excitement to a somber, heavy silence. They weren't just looking at wealth. They were looking at evidence of a crime scene that spanned a continent. Between the rows of pouches in the second crate, Silas found something else, a cylindrical metal tube, made of aluminum and sealed with a screw-top cap, similar to a map case or a mortar shell container. It was wedged tight to prevent movement. He unscrewed the cap, which hissed as the air pressure equalized. Inside was a roll of canvas, and wrapped inside the canvas was a leather-bound logbook and a sheaf of loose papers. The papers were not in German, but in English. They were typed on U.S. Navy letterhead, dated May 1945. The header on the top document read, Operation Eclipse, Asset Recovery and Transfer, Classified. Caleb unfolded the documents on top of the crate, using the diamonds as paperweights. The text detailed a covert transfer of seized strategic assets from a surrendered German U-boat in the North Atlantic to the SS Ironclad, which was operating under orders to transport the materials to a secure facility in Norfolk, Virginia. However, the logbook, written in the frantic hand of the Ironclad's captain, told a different story. The final entry, dated 3 days before the ship docked, described a change of conscience and a fear that the assets were being diverted by a rogue element within the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, rather than going to the Treasury. The captain had panicked. He couldn't turn the gold over to the men waiting at the dock, whom he suspected were corrupt, but he couldn't keep it either. He had sealed it in the blind void of the engine room, welded the wall shut, and falsified the manifest to show the cargo as lost at sea due to heavy weather. He had turned his ship into a bank vault, hoping to return for it when the dust settled. He never did. The brothers sat on the floor, surrounded by millions of dollars in gold and diamonds and the written confession of a dead man. The engine room, once just a place of scrap and rust, now felt like the center of a massive, unresolved conspiracy. They had 2 more crates to open, and if the pattern held, the stakes were only going to get higher. They weren't just scrappers anymore. They were the sole witnesses to a secret that had been waiting in the dark for 80 years. Caleb looked at the 3rd crate. It was larger than the first 2, and unlike the others, it had metal ventilation slats near the top, suggesting that whatever was inside needed to breathe, or perhaps keep cool. The 3rd crate was an anomaly. Unlike the rough-hewn oak boxes that held the bullion and the diamonds, this container was constructed from a darker, denser wood, likely teak or mahogany, and reinforced with heavy, galvanized steel corners. Along the upper rim, a series of louvered brass vents suggested that the contents were sensitive to humidity or heat, requiring airflow even in storage. The brothers approached it with a caution born of instinct. The gold and diamonds were static wealth, heavy but harmless, but a vented crate in a military shipment implied machinery, chemicals, or ordnance. The air in the engine room, already thick with the smell of old oil and the metallic tang of the cut bulkhead, seemed to grow heavier as they positioned the crowbar. Caleb took the lead, wedging the bar under the lid's reinforced lip. The wood didn't creak. It groaned, a deep, resonant sound of friction releasing its grip after decades of compression. When the lid finally popped free, it revealed an interior lined not with wood wool, but with molded, rubberized horsehair padding, shock absorption of the highest quality available in the 1940s. Nestled deeply within this protective cocoon was a device that looked like it belonged in a science fiction serial rather than a tugboat's hull. It was a complex assembly of polished aluminum housing, glass vacuum tubes, and intricate brass gearing, all centered around a suspended gyroscopic sphere. They carefully lifted the device out, struggling with its awkward center of gravity. It wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense. There was no barrel or trigger. It was a piece of guidance technology. Silas, who had spent years tinkering with marine navigation systems, recognized the fundamental architecture, but the sophistication was light years ahead of anything standard for 1945. It was a prototype inertial guidance system, likely for the V-2 rocket program or an even more advanced experimental projectile. This was the strategic asset the logbook had referred to. The gold and diamonds were merely the funding. This machine was the prize. It represented the leap in technology that the Allied powers were desperate to capture and the rogue OSS agents were desperate to sell to the highest bidder in the brewing Cold War. The brothers were staring at a piece of history that could have altered the trajectory of global military power, now sitting impotently on a greasy deck plate. But there was still 1 crate left. The 4th box was the smallest of the collection, tucked into the deepest corner of the hidden void. It was a stark, utilitarian metal case, painted a dull, matte gray, with no markings other than a single red stripe painted diagonally across the lid. It looked industrial and threatening. Unlike the others, which were meant for transport, this box looked like it was meant for storage or deployment. Caleb reached back into the hole to drag it out, but he froze. His hand, resting on the metal lid, felt a subtle difference in temperature. The box was colder than the surrounding air. He carefully slid it out onto the diamond plating. The metal case had a latch mechanism that was secured with a heavy padlock, but the shackle was severely rusted. A single, sharp blow with the hammer shattered the lock's mechanism. Silas stepped back, shining the light from a safer distance, while Caleb lifted the lid. The hinges shrieked in protest. The interior of the box stopped their hearts. It wasn't gold. It wasn't technology. It was chemistry. Inside, nestled in individual dividers, were 12 rectangular blocks wrapped in wax paper. They looked like oversized bars of soap, but the sweating, crystalline beads of liquid forming on their surface told a terrifying story. It was TNT, trinitrotoluene. But it wasn't just standard explosive blocks. These were rigged. Wired into the center of the blocks was a complex clockwork mechanism, a timer that had long since stopped, its mainspring wound down to 0. The wires, coated in brittle rubber insulation, ran from the timer to blasting caps embedded in the blocks. Caleb slowly, terrified to create even a vibration, lowered the lid but didn't latch it. He backed away, his face pale beneath the grime. The explosive blocks were suffering from exudation. Over decades of storage in a damp, temperature-fluctuating environment, the TNT had degraded. The nitroglycerin and other volatile components were separating from the binding agents, forming those innocent-looking beads of sweat on the surface. In this state, the explosives were no longer stable. They were hypersensitive. A dropped wrench, a stumble, or even the friction of moving the box could be enough to detonate the entire cache. The realization hit them with the force of a physical blow. The captain hadn't just hidden the treasure, he had booby-trapped it. Or perhaps he had rigged the ship to self-destruct to prevent the rogue agents from seizing the cargo, but the mechanism had failed. A rusted gear, a broken spring, leaving the Ironclad as a floating bomb for 50 years. The dismantling work they had been doing, the sledgehammers, the cutting torches, the dropping of heavy steel plates, had all taken place just inches away from enough unstable explosive to vaporize the hull and kill them instantly. They were trapped in the engine room with a fortune in gold, a priceless technological prototype, and a degradation timer bomb that was physically weeping instability. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from the thrill of discovery to a primal fight for survival. Every sound seemed amplified. The dripping of water from a pipe sounded like a countdown. The heat from the earlier torch work now felt oppressive, a potential trigger for the volatile chemicals. Silas signaled to Caleb to stop moving. They needed a plan. They couldn't just leave the explosives there. The vibrations from simply walking out of the room might be enough if the floor plates shifted the wrong way. But they couldn't move the box either. They needed to stabilize the situation before they could extract themselves or the treasure. The logbook, still lying open on the second crate, caught Silas's eye. He moved toward it with agonizing slowness, his boots placing 0 impact on the floor. He scanned the captain's frantic handwriting, looking for a schematic, a diagram, anything about the insurance charge. He found it on the last page. A hastily drawn sketch of the demolition charge. The captain had wired it into the ship's main DC electrical system as a failsafe, but had also included a mechanical timer. The note underneath read, "If the line is cut, the collapse of the magnetic field triggers the striker. If the timer runs out, the striker triggers." God forgive me. The brothers looked at the wires trailing from the metal box. They ran out of the back of the case and disappeared into the false bulkhead they had just cut open. In their haste to open the wall, they had sliced through steel and insulation. Had they cut the control wire? If the captain's note was true, cutting the wire should have detonated the charge instantly. The fact that they were still alive meant that either the battery powering the magnetic field had died decades ago, rendering the electrical trigger useless, or the mechanism was jammed. But the real danger was the chemical instability. The sweat on the dynamite was nitro. It was friction-sensitive. Caleb pointed to the specific blocks. The liquid had pooled at the bottom of the metal case. If they tilted the box, the liquid could flow, touch a rusted metal burr, and spark. They were standing on a landmine. Silas whispered the only option they had. They needed to neutralize the chemical threat before they could even think about the gold. They needed an absorbent. Something to soak up the nitroglycerin sweat without causing friction or heat. They looked around the greasy, industrial hellscape of the engine room. They had rags, they had sawdust from the pallets on the upper deck, and they had the wood wool from the gold crates. It was a terrifying gamble. Using the packing material from the Nazi gold to stabilize the Nazi bomb. Caleb carefully reached into the first crate, grabbing a handful of the fine timber shavings. He approached the metal box of death like a man approaching a sleeping tiger. His hands, usually steady with a welding torch, were trembling slightly. He had to pack the shavings around the blocks to absorb the liquid and prevent movement, effectively swaddling the bomb so it could be moved, or at least so they could evacuate the ship without their footsteps setting it off. He held his breath, leaning over the explosives. A single drop of sweat from his forehead fell, landing on the metal rim of the box with a tiny plink. Both brothers froze, eyes locked on the sweating dynamite. Nothing happened. Caleb exhaled and began to gently drift the wood wool over the unstable blocks, covering the deadliest object they had ever encountered with the shavings of a fortune they might never get to spend. The irony was suffocating. They were rich beyond their wildest dreams, but they were one wrong move away from being nothing but pink mist and scrap metal. The silence that followed the packing of the explosives was heavier than the steel hull surrounding them. Caleb's hands, coated in a mixture of engine grease and the fine dust of the wood wool, hovered over the gray metal box. He had packed the absorbent shavings tight against the sweating blocks of TNT, creating a makeshift buffer against friction. It was a terrifyingly fragile solution, a bandage on a bullet wound, but it was enough to buy them time. They gently, with agonizing slowness, lowered the lid of the box. They didn't dare engage the latch or try to move the container back into the wall. It sat there on the deck plates, a dormant beast that had been sleeping since 1945, now awake and irritable. The brothers backed away step by step, their eyes fixed on the red stripe painted on the lid, until they reached the ladder. Once they scrambled up the metal rungs and emerged into the cool, rain-slicked air of the main deck, the tension broke, replaced by a frantic, whispered strategy session. The reality of their situation was a paradox. They were standing on a retirement-level fortune, but they were also standing on a crime scene and a bomb site. Silas did the mental calculus. If they called the police or the bomb squad immediately, the site would be locked down. The federal government would seize the gold as lost wartime assets, the diamonds as evidence, and the guidance system as classified technology. The brothers would be lucky to get a thank-you note. More likely, they'd face an investigation for tampering with federal property. The only way to keep the fortune was to move it before reporting the danger. They decided on a desperate course of action. They would extract the stable cargo, the gold, the diamonds, and the prototype device, and hide it in their workshop's underground storm cellar. Only then, once the clean assets were secured, would they anonymously call in the bomb threat to deal with the unstable explosives, claiming they found the explosives during routine scrapping and knew nothing of any other cargo. It was a plan born of greed and adrenaline, ignoring the immense risk of moving heavy weights around a sensitive trigger mechanism. They rigged a manual pulley system from the overhead gantry crane, avoiding the electric winch to prevent any voltage spikes or vibrations that might disturb the magnetic field trigger mentioned in the captain's note. The extraction was grueling. The gold crate was too heavy to lift whole, so they had to ferry the bars up in canvas buckets, hand over hand. Each bar was a brick of condensed history, heavy and cold. They worked in a rhythmic trance, the rain soaking their coveralls, passing the buckets from the engine room hatch to the waiting bed of their yard truck. The contrast was surreal. The grimy, rusted industrial salvage yard, filled with worthless jagged iron, and the steadily growing pile of pristine, Nazi-stamped bullion accumulating under a dirty tarp in the truck bed. By the time the diamonds and the strange gyroscopic device were loaded, the sky had turned a bruised purple, the sun dipping below the horizon. The salvage yard was officially closed, the gates locked, the perimeter lights flickering on with a low hum. They were exhausted, their muscles burning, but the truck was loaded. They had done it. The clean treasure was out of the kill zone. All that remained in the Ironclad's belly was the unstable metal case and the empty wooden crates. They planned to drive the truck into their secure barn, unload the gold, and then make the anonymous call from a payphone miles away. But as Caleb climbed into the driver's seat and reached for the ignition, Silas grabbed his arm. He pointed toward the main gate of the salvage yard, about 200 yards away at the end of the gravel drive. A pair of headlights cut through the gloom. They weren't the flashing red and blue lights of the police, nor the amber strobes of a utility truck. They were the piercing blue-white beams of high-end halogen projectors, attached to a sleek, black SUV that looked entirely out of place on the potholed industrial access road. The vehicle sat there, idling just outside the chain-link fence, its engine purring with a low, menacing rumble. It didn't honk. It didn't flash its lights. It just watched. Silas felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The salvage yard was located at the end of a dead-end road in a forgotten industrial district. Nobody came here by accident, especially not after dark. He thought back to the captain's logbook, the mention of a rogue element, a powerful group that had been hunting the gold in 1945. The captain had hidden the ship to escape them. For decades, the ship had been lost in a backwater channel, effectively invisible. But Caleb and Silas had bought it, towed it, filed transfer papers, and registered the hull number in the state database. They had turned the beacon back on. If the organization that hunted the Ironclad 80 years ago had any surviving legacy, any keepers of the flame watching the registries for the reappearance of the lost shipment, the brothers had just rung the dinner bell. The black SUV was joined by a second vehicle, this one a dark panel van that pulled up behind it, extinguishing its lights immediately. The stealth of the arrival screamed professionalism. This wasn't a random theft. This was a recovery team. The brothers were trapped. The only exit from the yard was the main gate, which was now blocked by the mysterious convoy. They were armed with nothing but cutting torches and crowbars. The gold in the truck bed, moments ago their ticket to paradise, was now a massive liability. If these men were here for the shipment, they wouldn't leave witnesses. Suddenly, a faint buzzing sound cut through the noise of the rain. Silas looked up. Hovering 50 feet above the Ironclad, barely visible against the dark clouds, was a commercial drone. Its camera gimbal swiveled, the small red recording light blinking like a baleful eye. It was scanning the deck, the open hatch, and the loaded truck. The intruders weren't just blocking the exit, they were assessing the situation. They knew the ship was being dismantled. They knew the timeline. The driver's door of the lead SUV opened. A man stepped out. He was dressed not in tactical gear, but in a sharp, dark raincoat, holding a large umbrella. He walked calmly to the locked gate, unbothered by the mud or the rain. He didn't try to cut the lock. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a megaphone. His voice, amplified and distorted, rolled across the scrapyard, echoing off the mountains of twisted metal. He didn't ask who they were. He didn't ask if they were open. He spoke with the terrifying confidence of someone who owned the situation. "Gentlemen," the voice boomed, calm and precise, "we are aware you have breached the secondary bulkhead of the Ironclad. You have retrieved property that belongs to a private trust established in 1944. We are not the police. We are not the government. We simply want the return of the 4 crates. Open the gate, leave the truck where it is, and walk away. You will be compensated for your labor. Refuse, and we will enter. And we are aware of the thermal instability of the 4th crate. Do not make a mistake that ends your lives." The blood drained from Silas's face. They knew everything. They knew about the bulkhead. They knew about the 4th crate, the bomb. They knew exactly what was on board. The rogue element wasn't history. It was right outside their gate. The brothers looked at each other in the cab of the truck. They were outgunned and surrounded. But they had one advantage the man in the suit didn't account for. The brothers were on their home turf, a maze of sharp steel and heavy machinery, and they were sitting on the only leverage that mattered. Caleb looked at the megaphone man, then looked at the ship. He shifted the truck into reverse, not toward the gate, but back toward the Ironclad. Caleb threw the truck into reverse, the tires spinning wildly in the gravel mud before finding traction. He didn't drive toward the gate. He drove deeper into the labyrinth of the scrapyard. The brothers knew their own terrain better than anyone. They navigated the heavy salvage truck through narrow alleys formed by stacked shipping containers and crushed fuselages, finally jamming the vehicle into the dark recess of the metal shredder bay, effectively hiding the gold from immediate view. But they knew this was a temporary measure. The men in the SUV were not common thieves. They were a recovery team, methodical and likely tracking the thermal signature of the truck engine. The brothers killed the headlights and scrambled out of the cab, the rain instantly soaking them to the bone. They had only one card left to play, and it lay in the belly of the Ironclad. They sprinted back toward the tugboat, their boots sliding on the wet iron of the gangway as they boarded the vessel that had started this nightmare. The headlights of the SUV and the van breached the main gate, the chain-link fence tearing away like tissue paper. The vehicles moved slowly, shark-like, sweeping the yard with their high beams. The drone hovered lower, buzzing angrily as it searched for the truck. Silas and Caleb stood on the main deck of the Ironclad, fully exposed under the yard's security floodlights. It was a calculated risk. They needed to draw the attention of the intruders away from the hidden truck and toward the ship. Silas held a heavy sledgehammer in his hands, resting the head on the steel deck plate directly above the engine room. Caleb stood by the wheelhouse, his hand gripping the manual pull chain for the yard's emergency fire siren, an old, deafening industrial klaxon used to alert the volunteer fire department in town. The black SUV stopped at the base of the ship. 3 men exited, moving with tactical precision, weapons drawn but held low. The man in the raincoat stepped forward, his face illuminated by the ambient glow of the floodlights. He stopped at the bottom of the gangway, looking up at the brothers. He didn't shout. He simply gestured for them to come down. The threat was implicit. If they didn't comply, the tactical team would storm the deck. But Silas didn't move. He raised the sledgehammer high above his head, poising it to strike the deck plate with maximum force. The man in the raincoat paused. He knew exactly what was beneath that deck. The unstable TNT in the engine room was sweating nitroglycerin. A shockwave from a sledgehammer blow directly above the engine block would almost certainly be enough to trigger a sympathetic detonation. The standoff was absolute. The brothers were holding themselves hostage, using the explosive instability of the ship as a shield. If the mercenaries fired, the brothers dropped the hammer. If they stormed the ramp, the hammer dropped. The explosion would vaporize the ship, the brothers, and the recovery team standing on the pier. The rain hammered down, washing over the tense scene. Silas stared down at the leader, his message clear without a word being spoken. We die, you die, and nobody gets the gold. The leader of the trust hesitated, checking his watch. They were professionals working on a strict timeline. A massive explosion would bring federal heat that no amount of bribery could cover up. Caleb seized the moment of hesitation. He yanked the chain on the industrial siren. The sound was apocalyptic, a mechanical scream that tore through the night, audible for 5 miles in every direction. It wasn't just a noise, it was a summon. In the quiet coastal town, that siren meant a major disaster, and the local police and fire brigade would be rolling within minutes. The drone pilot panic-landed the device in the van. The leader looked from the siren to the brothers, his expression hardening. The window of opportunity had slammed shut. The risk of exposure was now greater than the value of the recovery. He made a sharp cutting motion with his hand. The tactical team holstered their weapons and retreated to the vehicles with disciplined speed. The SUV reversed, tires screeching, and the convoy sped out of the ruined gate, disappearing into the rainy night just as the first wails of police cruisers began to echo in the distance. The brothers didn't lower the hammer until the tail lights were gone. They collapsed on the wet deck, shaking from adrenaline and the cold. When the authorities arrived, a chaotic mix of sheriff's deputies and firefighters, the scene they found was baffling. 2 scrappers sitting on a tugboat, a ruined gate, and a yard siren blaring. But the brothers didn't lie. They led the sheriff to the shredder bay and showed him the truck bed. They showed him the gold bars stamped with the swastika, the bag of diamonds, and the guidance system. Then, they pointed to the ship and explained the bomb. The site was immediately evacuated, and the jurisdiction shifted rapidly from the local sheriff to the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security. The next 3 days were a blur of interrogations, bomb disposal units, and federal agents in suits. The bomb squad successfully neutralized the TNT, using a chemical freezing agent to stabilize the nitroglycerin before removing the crate for controlled detonation in a sandpit. The gold and the artifacts were seized under the treasure trove laws and the Trading with the Enemy Act. The history of the Ironclad was unraveled by naval historians. The Trust was a remnant of a rogue OSS operation that had morphed into a shadow syndicate, waiting decades for the ship to resurface. The brothers had accidentally intercepted a dark inheritance. However, the story didn't end with the brothers empty-handed. Because they had voluntarily surrendered the assets and their cooperation had led to the recovery of significant historical property and the exposure of the criminal network, via the drone footage recorded on the ship's security cameras, they were entitled to a massive finder's fee. The legal battle was short. The government wanted the case closed quietly. The brothers were awarded a percentage of the bullion spot value, a sum that totaled just over $4 million. Caleb and Silas stood in their new office a year later, looking out over the yard. The mud was gone, replaced by paved concrete. The old crane was replaced by a state-of-the-art magnetic lifter. The SS Ironclad was gone, finally scrapped, its steel recycled into new girders for a bridge in the city. They had melted down the beast that almost killed them. But on the wall of their office, framed behind UV protective glass, was the single item they had been allowed to keep, the brass builder's plate of the tugboat, polished to a shine. They had bought a dead ship for the price of scrap, and in its rusted heart, they found a fortune that tested their courage and changed their lives forever. The salvage business was dirty, dangerous work, but sometimes, just sometimes, the junk pile hid a kingdom.